In today's video, we're back with some updated NHL rumors, including several updates on the Vancouver Canucks, the Minnesota Wild, the Boston Bruins, and of course, Elliot Friedman also has an additional update on the Mitch Marner contract situation with the Maple Leafs. We'll get into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back here to Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have several updates around many situations going around the NHL. And let's first get started here with the Vancouver Canucks. Now, we recently had General Manager Jim Benning complete a radio interview with Sportsnet, and there was a lot of interesting tidbits that came out of that conversation. Now, first and foremost, of course, he was asked about contract negotiations with Brock Boeser, who's obviously one of the top RFAs out there that still remain to be unsigned. At this point, he said that he and the agent for Boeser have had some great conversations. It doesn't sound like a contract was imminent by any means, but he was very hopeful and optimistic that they'd be able to get him signed before training camp. He did make a comment saying he wasn't really sure what other teams were doing or whatever, so I'm not really sure that they're really paying too close of attention to the overall market. He also referenced the fact that guys like Kyle Connor and Timo Meier would be kind of used as comparables and other players that they feel are, somewhat similar enough to Brock Boeser when it comes to the contract negotiations. Now, of course, Timo Meier already signed his contract with the Sharks, which appeared to be a pretty solid deal for them. And of course, Kyle Connor remains unsigned with Winnipeg. So maybe if Connor ends up signing first, perhaps that'll kind of trigger a Brock Boeser deal. Now, in the previous interview with Kyle Connor, it made it sound like he was really hoping for a longer-term deal. And of course, we've heard different options with the Boeser camp and the Canucks as far as what they'll get done for a contract, whether or not it'll end up being, a shorter-term bridge deal or a longer-term. But it seems as though it's probably going to end up somewhere in that $7 million mark. That's kind of what most people kind of expect at this point. Now, he also made a couple other interesting comments. First, regarding Louis Eriksson and the fact that he has spoken to him a few times over the summer. They did try trading him. They did explore many options in that regard, but nothing really materialized. And at this point, he seems less optimistic that it's something like that is actually going to happen. As we've discussed on different occasions here before, of course, we've seen a lot of other bad contracts end up getting swapped throughout the summer. Unfortunately, Eriksson wasn't one of them, and I'm just not really sure that it was really all that easy for them to do. But of course, moving that contract would be a huge relief when it comes to their salary cap situation. So we'll see what happens, but at this point, I think we can expect Louis Eriksson to at least be in training camp with the Canucks. Now, he also made another interesting point regarding trading their first-round selection at the draft to acquire JT Miller from the Tampa Bay Lightning. He made it known that he would be interested in trying to acquire another first-round pick, possibly near the trade deadline, to kind of recoup that draft pick moving forward. But he felt that at the time he really needed to make that move to make the team better, that he doesn't really like trading first-round picks. It's the first time he's done it as a general manager, but felt it was necessary. It was a good opportunity to improve the club, and that he feels like he can recoup another one by the trade deadline. Now, the only question for me that comes with that is that tells me that they're likely maybe not expecting to make the playoffs. I mean, I know they've made a lot of improvements, and there's been a lot of talk about whether or not the Canucks either could be or will be a playoff team this year. And I do think, regardless of what happens, they should be a better team, get better results. Because of their division that they're in, I think there is a remote possibility they very well could be a playoff team, depending on how everything goes with the other clubs. But if they're going to be selling off something to get a first-round pick at the deadline, that's usually not something you do if you think you're going to be a playoff team. At the same time, we've seen some teams kind of take that approach in the past, even though they are going to make the playoffs, but it's just not usually a common thing that you see. So are the Canucks kind of setting the expectations that maybe they won't be a playoff team this year? And who could it possibly trade at the deadline to acquire a first-round pick? Usually they get a pick that high in return from some of the teams that are going into the playoffs. You usually have to be trading a pretty decent player, so it's really hard to say based on that roster where everybody's contracts are at, what they could possibly be looking to move by the deadline to get a first-round selection in place. So let me know what you think. If the Canucks are likely going to make a trade throughout the year to pick up a first-round pick by the trade deadline, who would their most likely trade target be off their roster? And we've also seen some reports out of Boston indicating that they're working on an extension for current head coach Bruce Cassidy. Of course, Cassidy's been there now for 3 seasons, has had a ton of success. They've made the playoffs all 3 years, including a deep playoff run this past year, unfortunately losing in the Stanley Cup Finals. He's got a record of 117, 52, and 22 over those past 3 seasons. He's certainly been in contention for the Jack Adams Trophy a couple of times as well. And really overall, he seems to be a great fit there and he's had a great successful run so far. So a contract extension with a fairly significant raise likely should be coming soon for Coach Cassidy. At the same time, though, there's been no new updates on pending unrestricted free agent defenseman Torrey Krug. Right now, there are reports indicating that nothing really new is on that front, and they don't seem to be any closer to offering an extension to the offensive defenseman. Now, as we reported on yesterday, of course, the Minnesota Wild have a new general manager, and that's former NHL player and longtime assistant GM Billy Guerin, formerly of the Penguins. And obviously, he's going to be making some moves here soon to kind of put his stamp on the team and kind of dictate the direction that they're going to be heading in. Now, according to Michael Russo of The Athletic, he kind of feels that there's a couple of key trades they very well might try to make during the season, especially if they're out of the playoffs. And to be honest, I do think there's a pretty good chance the Wild will be out of the playoffs. Based on what we've seen last year and other moves that have been made with this club, I really think they will struggle to make the playoffs for the coming season. And he feels that defenseman Jared Spurgeon is definitely a big-time trade candidate, given his age and the fact that he's likely looking for a long-term big money deal, which according to Russo seems to be what he's looking for. It very well could be Spurgeon's last big payday, and that the Minnesota Wild likely are not prepared to spend that much money and give that much term to a player at that stage in his career. So of course we'll see what Billy Guerin seems to think and what direction he takes the team, but Russo feels that Spurgeon more than likely is traded and very well could perhaps be a fairly big acquisition for many teams looking to add at the trade deadline. They also feel a longtime forward Mikko Koivu very well could be traded as well, because like Spurgeon, he's also a pending unrestricted free agent. And if they're going to be out of the playoffs, then he very well might want to have another crack to go somewhere else and see if he can win himself a Stanley Cup. So either way, we'll see where Billy Guerin takes the Minnesota Wild. But for right now, according to Michael Russo, he fully suspects those two players are big-time trade bait for the team, especially if they're out of the playoffs by the trade deadline and things aren't looking like they're going to make it. But Spurgeon, either way, I think very well could be traded if they don't intend on signing him to a long-term extension. And of course, we've had some updates here that we discussed on our channel recently regarding Mitch Marner and the possibility of him going to Switzerland, at least for training purposes, possibly to play. Of course, those reports came out here in the last couple of days from his agent saying that they've been exploring those opportunities. And of course, the team over there, Zurich Lions, confirmed that they have had discussions as well. At this point, the discussions were only about training and practicing. It wasn't necessarily to sign and play, because I do think Mitch Marner definitely wants to play for the Leafs and he wants to play in the NHL this coming season. They're just working on a contingency plan here in case that doesn't happen. Now, of course, mostly that's posturing on the agent's part. We've seen that numerous times with his other clients in the last few years. I really don't think there's really any threat of Mitch Marner playing in another league. But could he practice with a professional team somewhere if he's not signed when training camp opens? It's certainly a possibility, and I wouldn't completely rule that out. Although I do think the odds of it happening are still relatively slim, but things can change here over time. Now, NHL insider Elliot Friedman recently did an interview on the radio with Sportsnet and had a couple of interesting quotes regarding the Marner contract situation. Elliot Friedman went on to say, "The thing about the Marner thing that really is fascinating to me is that I've had people tell me they don't think they're all that far apart on a short-term deal. I've had other people telling me that the team is really starting to get fed up with the way this is going, and we'll see where it goes." Later in the interview, he says, "To me, I think the frustration is that if you want to do a long-term deal, they just haven't moved anywhere. I think that the organization is really frustrated by that it isn't going anywhere. The other thing, too, is that I just really think the feeling is with the Leafs and what happened with Nylander, they're not doing that again. They're not going through that again. They are not signing a guy on December 1st. I think there's a lot of frustration there because of that." Now, Friedman also added near the end of the interview that he wouldn't be surprised if Mitch Marner is frustrated as well, because obviously he wants to get this done. He wants to play. He wants to get paid appropriately, and obviously very well could be frustrated that things aren't coming together the way that he wanted as well. Now, another quick note here as well, the Leafs don't want to go to December 1st, but they really can't. Last year they had so much more flexibility with the salary cap and the Nylander situation, and even though they let it drag on as bad as they did, which they probably do regret now, they had that flexibility, whereas this year they don't. As soon as the season starts, if a player signs before December 1st, but after day one of the season, their cap hit goes up a little bit every day based on the total contract because it's prorated for the whole year. Like Nylander's cap hit last year ended up being over $10 million, even though he was making less than $7 million. So clearly the Leafs are not in a situation with their salary cap situation to handle that at all. So the fact that Friedman says he believes that they're actually pretty close based on what he's been told on a short-term deal, to me, I think that's the most logical solution that they're heading towards, probably like a 3-year deal. I don't see them wanting to do 4 years. I don't see them wanting to do 5 years. It's been known that the Marner camp really didn't want to do 8 years. I think there's a lot of risk on both sides as well, maybe doing a 1-year deal. So I think 3 is probably a nice happy medium where he's still not an unrestricted free agent yet. It's not too long-term. He can cash in again, kind of continue to prove himself, and we'll see. But obviously he wants Matthews' money, and until the Leafs kind of give into that, we may or might still be at a stalemate when training camp gets underway. But I guess we'll see. I do think there will be a lot more urgency to get this done as training camp opens. So of course, as always, let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section and we can continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.